today, and I am going to hand this over to Emily to talk a little bit about her dissertation work in the Mid-Columbia.
All right, awesome. Can everybody hear me okay?
Okay. You sound great.
Awesome. All right, so I'm gonna start with screen sharing. Okay. All right, how's that look to everyone?
It looks good.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. My name's Emily Carlson, and I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University. And we're here to talk about creating pollinator habitat. Now, throughout my presentation, we're going to be using a little plugin for audience participation. So if you don't mind humoring me, I have a little test question here to get us started. So what you're gonna wanna do is take your cell phone and hold it up to the QR code that you can see on your screen right now. When you click the link for that QR code, it will allow you to participate in this poll. So this is just a little test poll to see if we can get it working. And I see 2 of you already have done it. Awesome. So keep going. And the question is, who's currently ranked #1 for men's basketball in the NCAA?
Hey,
Cool.
why aren't the Beavers on there?
Because they're not even close, Andony. I wanted to make it difficult in case you actually know something about basketball. You know, all these teams are in the top tier, you know, so great, awesome. I'll give you guys another couple seconds to get up there. Nice, I see we are hitting our stride. All right, well, let's call it there for now. So who's currently ranked #1 for men's basketball? Let's see what you guys think. Ooh, nice. All right, so Gonzaga is correct. Gonzaga University, which translates well into a little bit about me. My name's Emily Carlson. I'm a PhD student. I got my undergrad at Gonzaga, hence the basketball question. And I am studying native and honeybee interactions in cherry fields in the Dalles, Oregon. So I'm here to talk to you today about that. So first, so you guys know a little bit about me, but what about you? Can you tell me, based off of this slide, what you guys, where you guys are working? Ooh, this one's going live. It's like a race. Nice. So far, nobody works in anything besides tree fruit. That's interesting. Oh, there we go. Cool. Great. All right, well, let's call it there. So it looks like mostly pear and a little bit of cherry. That's really helpful for me to know. And hopefully kind of fun for you guys to participate. So where are you currently living? I am obviously from Oregon State, but I heard we might have some Washington folks with us as well. I went to school in Spokane, so I have a soft spot in my heart for Washington. Great, that's awesome. Cool. All right, so now that I know you and you know me, let's talk about what we're going to cover in this presentation. So this presentation is going to have 3 parts. The first one, we're going to talk about some of the different bees of Oregon. Second, we're going to talk about recognizing opportunities for pollinator habitat in orchards. So where might you look if you're interested in installing pollinator habitat? And then the third point we're going to talk about is concepts for successful pollinator habitat. So regardless of where you install this habitat, here are some, general ideas you'll want to keep in mind. So section 1, bees of Oregon, aka bees are cool. So Chris and I agree on this. Let's start out with the most familiar bee. So this is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. And you guys are probably familiar with these social bees. They live in large managed colonies with thousands of individuals. And you, as cherry and pear growers, probably call up your local beekeeper to get some delivered to your orchards for pollination. Here's a picture of honeybee colonies working hard in the Dalles doing cherry pollination. And little pop quiz. So you're probably familiar with this structure of hives. You've probably seen these around your orchards. How many hives are in here? 1, 4, or 12. So I put this on here so you can kind of get an idea, and then we'll click to the actual poll. Have your answer in mind. All right, so how many hives were in that last photo? Do you guys have a guess? Nice. Well, that's great. So the majority of you guys are correct. There are 4 hives on that palette. And so each hive is about is two boxes tall, and then you can sometimes have a honey super. So this would be full of honey on top of the actual body of the hive. But most of our bees that live in Oregon are not honeybees. We have a lot of other species of bee native to Oregon State. So I want to ask you guys, about how many species of bee do you think live in Oregon, if you had to guess? Ooh, this one's not updating. Interesting. You guys are getting very speedy at this. Nice job. All right. So the correct answer is over 500 species of bee live in Oregon State, which to me is pretty remarkable, and honestly is pretty diverse when it comes to bee fauna. We're very lucky here. So here in Oregon, we have more bee species in Oregon than there are east of the Mississippi River. So we have a lot of different bee fauna to protect and enjoy. All right, so bees may or may not look a little different than you expect. What do you guys think? Is this a bee? Nice. We've got a pretty good split. So the answer is yes, that is a bee. It's a cuckoo bee. And what about this one? To be or not to be? Please forgive the puns. Do you think that's a bee? Nice. So you guys are correct. Those are both 2 different species of bee. That's a sweat bee, the little green one. And no matter what they look like, bees require a suitable nesting substrate from which they have access to adequate forage over the course of their individual or colonial lifespans, right? So we may have bees that look very different, but they all need these basic things, which is access to a nesting area and forage, which is going to be on flowers for pollen and nectar. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the different broad groups of bees that we have here in Oregon State. First of all, social bees. These are going to probably be the most familiar to us because they have a similar life history to honeybees. And so they live in colonies. For example, bumblebees. We've got about 20 different species of bumblebee that you can find. And they have this kind of colonial life structure, this social life history where the females, the queens, mated queens overwinter. So they are resting in leaves or in little hibernaculum, which is just the name for the nest that the queen makes when she's resting over winter. She'll emerge and begin founding the nest, builds a full nest with her daughters, kind of like a honeybee where, you know, you have the queen and then her daughters are all taking care of the nest. That nest will produce another generation of queens which mate and then overwinter. So in bumblebees, every bee is about can be less than a year old. So this is obviously similar to honeybees, but what percent of bee species do you guys think are social? So out of all the species of bee, what percent do you think match up with the sort of life history that we'd find in bumblebees or honeybees? Great. Awesome. All right, let's see what you guys think. Ooh, wow. That's like a pretty even split all the way across. It's about 10%. It's a little less than 10% of all bee species are social. And so, of course, what that means is that 90% of them are solitary bee species. So let's talk about those for a moment. So solitary bee species you can think of them as like the single mom of the bee world. So unlike a nest of bumblebees or honeybees, which have a whole group of daughters to help you take care of your young, these bees do everything themselves, including nest building and resource foraging. All happens with just one bee. And so the first category I want to talk about is just wood nesting solitary bees. And so you might be familiar with leaf cutting bees or mason bees, which form their nests in little cavities, and they separate each cell with pulp or leaves. And you can see the developing larva and pollen ball here. So mason bees are a great example of this. Oh, whoops. Mason bees are a great example of this type of bee, which you guys were talking about in the Q&A section. So they fly for about 3 to 4 weeks, and they are excellent fruit pollinators. And you can see here that they construct nests of kind of mud within these wooden cavities. We also have ground nesting solitary bees. So this is the vast majority of bee species. They dig nests into the soil and provision that with pollen and nectar. And you can see here the cute little larva developing on top of that tasty pollen ball. So what is the moral of the story here? The moral of the story is that bees of Oregon vary greatly in both their size, their appearance, their behavior, their effectiveness as pollinators, their floral choices, and their nesting location. And these are all different species of bee that you could find here in Oregon. And what I think is also really important to note about this is that even though we are really reliant on the honeybee to do a lot of our pollination work, what the honeybee needs and is interested in and their life history is not necessarily the same as what all these other different species of bee require to be happy and healthy and to thrive. All right. So section 2, I'm going to talk with you guys about opportunities for pollinator habitat. Alternative title, location, location, location. So little pop quiz, if I were to ask you, where could you find the most native bees in your kind of surrounding area? Where would you look for your native bees? Would you look for native, would you go in the native habitat? Would you look at the orchard bloom, so the cherry or the pear? What about the understory of weeds, or into a mass blooming cover crop? Nice. All right, awesome. Well, you guys are way ahead of the curve. I expected this to be much more difficult, to be a little trickier, but you are right on the money. So if you are looking for native bees, the best place to find them is probably the native habitat. And that's what my research has been suggesting. So one of the first things that you can do if you want to support pollinators and think about pollinator conservation and habitat is to conserve native habitat. And this makes sense, right? If you are a native bee that has evolved in Oregon State for thousands of years, then you are going to be interested in the native flowers, and potentially very specialized on those native flowers. Also here we have a nice log which could serve as some nesting habitat for native bees. And these floral resources are very diverse. They change over time. And there's something that can be very difficult to recreate in planting. So I basically want to talk about here that, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you have native habitat, it makes sense to protect it if you're interested in supporting native pollinators. And I think a good point here is that, you know, managing an orchard doesn't necessarily need to clash with conserving native habitat, because you can look for and improve areas that are difficult to farm. So I basically have this photo here of down below on the left, there's a cherry orchard, which is being managed. And then the slope of the ground becomes so steep that it would be really difficult to have a cherry orchard here. And so this has been left as native habitat, which is doing great work supporting native pollinators. And so here's a box of bees, which was taken from my research. So these are all individual bees, which were caught in and around cherry orchards in the Dalles. And they, the vast majority of these come from the native habitat surrounding the orchards. And, you know, these bees are mostly staying out of your orchards. So the other thing that you might consider is installing some sort of permanent planting. And so this is important to consider where you might want to put it, because you're not going to be changing, you're not going to be ripping it up after a few years. So you want to look for places which are going to be out of the way, for example, the edges of fields, alongside roads, or you might want to strategically place these plantings to reduce noise or wind. And if you work with your local conservation district, you can oftentimes get hedgerow plantings that are pre-designed. And so this would be an example of a permanent installation where this conservation district has created a lovely planting plan that has a diversity of bloom. And really important when you're installing permanent habitat is to plan for maturity. So if you are installing a tree that is going to grow to be 20 feet tall, you need to make sure that the land can support that 20-foot tall tree for the majority of its life. And so here's an example of a hedgerow in Gales Meadow Farm, which it has been planted sort of looks like between some fields in an area that was not really farmable. And here's an example of a hedgerow, which is primarily lavender, alongside a road, protecting this crop here. And so I just put this photo in because you can see there's a fence line here, and maybe if you were really interested in a permanent planting, it would be a good idea to put something along a fence row. So the next category of planting that you might do is something which is a cover crop or a rotational planting. And so this would be a type of habitat that is not planned to last forever, right? You're going to install this blooming cover crop, and then eventually it will get tilled under or removed. And so some places that you might look when you're hoping to install this type of planting is between orchard rows, in fallow fields, or in young orchards where you're not doing as much management. So here's an example of, I believe this is a pear tree, which has mass blooming clover in between the rows. And so this is, obviously going to be providing forage to bees while the pear is not in bloom. And hopefully doing some other work for you too. I know NRCS has some great information about what other benefits cover crops can provide. I just want to point out, it's not super relevant to us here, but there is a project in California which is working with orchardists to install blooming cover crop habitat in between the rows of almond. And this is called Seeds for Bees. It's one of the largest in the nation. And they're really doing a lot of research, both in connection with Oregon State, on how these function and what kind of work they're doing. So out of these three different habitat types and opportunities, which one interests you the most, if you had to pick? I'm not seeing the updates. Okay, whew, I was like, uh-oh, is there something wrong? And I think it's really important to keep in mind as well when you're deciding on these habitat plantings, who you most want to help. Do you want to support the honeybees that are coming in to pollinate, or do you want to support the native bees that are living in that area, because they're not necessarily going to be exactly the same needs? And we'll talk more about that. Great. Awesome. Well, that's good to know. Conserving habitat, I think, is a great way to help pollinators and protect them. Great. So now we're going to talk about one specific example of an opportunity for pollinator habitat. And I really like this example because pollinator habitat and including supporting native pollinators has been built into this management routine. So this is an example of a rotational planting or a cover crop planting that's going to serve some, it's going to perform some use and then be rotated out when it's no longer needed. So first of all, this system, you have orchards which are either no longer profitable or they're too old. So I believe in this photo, it is apple orchards that were being converted into a different crop. And so first of all, you have this orchard, which is not desirable to you. And so you pull it out and clear the land. You can see this is a photo of burning that was to get rid of the orchard debris and all of that wood to reduce it down. And then the native cover crop was planted in these fallow orchards. And so you can see this is a mass bloom of mustard, that bright yellow, which is now growing in the field of this old orchard. And these can be quite large habitat blocks. You have Andony here for scale, which bloom throughout the season. So these particular fields bloomed for about a month. And we found, or I found doing this research, that native bees are indeed using these spaces. And so this is a great way to support native pollinators, is to have these mass blooming cover crops. And here's an example of, you can see also you could seed in between these young orchard rows, and eventually this habitat will become a young orchard when it is replanted after it takes a little bit of a break. All right, so now we're going to move into section 3, which is concepts for success. So we've learned about how cool bees are and why we should be excited about them. We've also talked about where you might look in your farm and in your management schedule for opportunities for pollinator habitat. And now we're going to talk about, okay, what are some general concepts that you should keep in mind as you're installing pollinator habitat? And I'm going to go ahead and tell you right up front, you will hear me say it multiple times, the #1 predictor of any sort of planting success is how well you control the weed species that are there. So this is subtitled, AKA kill all the weeds. And I want to mention that although we're not going to walk through 10 concepts, this portion of the talk is adapted from Creating Pollinator Habitat, 10 different principles for ensuring a good start. And so you can check out this publication as well if you want even more fun pollinator stuff. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when you're installing your pollinator habitat or considering your pollinator planting is to try to select a diversity of flower types. And there's actually, I mean, as orchard growers and people who work outdoors with nature, you probably have already noticed that there's a wide diversity of different types of flowers in the physical shape that they have, as well as their size and color. And this is really important because different bees can be specialized on different flowers. We'll talk about that in a second, but also different flowers provide different resources. So for example, California poppy does not produce nectar, it only produces pollen. And so you can imagine if you had a huge planting of only California poppy, this could be a problem for bees because they wouldn't have access to nectar resources. Same with lupin. So you guys are probably familiar with the big leaf lupin that's very common in the Dalles area in the mid-Columbia region. So that's only producing pollen. And so having all of these different flower shapes and different flower types can provide a variety of resources to bees, as well as support a variety of pollinators. And this is basically this is a little breakdown of a study that was done where they tracked bees visiting black-eyed Susan and this Russian sage. And there were honeybees and native bees in the area. And what they found was that the honeybees were almost exclusively on the Russian sage, and the native bees were either using a different resource entirely, or they were using the Russian sage when the honeybees were not present. And so this is kind of showing, again, that difference in what native bees are needing versus what honeybees are needing. Oh, yes, again, so what the honeybee needs might not be exactly what the native bees all need. And this is reflected in some research looking at what seed mixes support honeybees and native bees. So essentially what this shows here, let's start with the honeybee. So on the y-axis, we have the number of bee observations. And then on the x-axis, we have the number of species of flowers. And so you see here that you really only need 3 species to see a maximum number of honeybees in the mix. But every time you add a new species of wildflower, you find more and more species of native bee in the mix. And so this is kind of showing you that honeybees have, you know, these hard-hitting favorite flowers that they're looking for, whereas native bees have a more subtle connection to the landscape and are, you know, looking for that diversity. Oh yeah, so this is just cumulatively showing that the 26 species mix had the most native bee observations, whereas the 3 species mix had the most honeybee observations overall. And it's also important to note that the 3 species mix is much less expensive to install than the 26 species mix, which makes sense. And this is, so I mentioned before pollen specialization and how native bees are interested in different things than honeybees. So you can either be polylectic, like a honeybee, which means you collect and digest pollen from a wide variety of plants, or you can be oligolectic or monolectic. So what that means is you're specializing more in, you're more picky about what flowers you visit. And this is reflected in the physiology of the bees too. So for example, you can imagine that this bee, which has an extremely long tongue, is going to forage on very different resources than this bee, which has a really teeny tiny tongue. And so if you're, as I said before, if you're oligolectic, you're collecting and digesting pollen from a limited range of plant species. And so you won't even see that bee if you don't have those special species there. And monolectic is just even more limited and specialized. So here's some beautiful pictures of bees foraging on their host plants. So the next concept that you're going to want to master is making sure that flowering time overlaps. So we talked about how bees need resources throughout the time that they're foraging. And for native bees, that's going to be different times of year as well. So a bee might only forage for 3 to 4 weeks, and you want to make sure that you have bloom available for them during that whole time. One great example of this is WSU's Dr. Kim Patton. So he works in cranberry and has created a special seed mix, which is targeted at providing bloom both before and after cranberry comes on to support the native pollinators which visit cranberry. And I also just wanted to point out here, if you're interested in finding out what type of native species might fill in those bloom gaps, Xerces Society has a great list of resources where they break down all the different species that bloom throughout these periods. And so again, including natives and not just exotic plants if you want to support native bees as well as honeybees. And this is research out of OSU showing that essentially you get the most honeybees on exotic species, and then you will see more and more native bees on native plant species. So down here are all different types of flowers, and then these are bee abundance metrics. So you can see that the other native bees which is this dark orange color, is more common in the flowers which don't have asterisks on them, because those are the native species. All right. So what are some benefits of native plants aside from just being good for pollinators? And this one, I believe you can click, you should be able to click more than one answer. I have a soft spot for native plants, and yeah, they can do a lot of work for your landscape. Nice. Great job. So you are all right. All three of these are correct. Native plants are typically adapted to a local climate and therefore are hardy. They typically require less water than exotic species, and they support native wildlife through these associations that we've been talking about, right? So how the native bees are specifically associating with those native plants. You can imagine it's a similar kind of story for birds and other animals like that. Great. So the next thing you could do is consider enhancing native habitat. So this is an example of a field of vetch, which is on nearby a cherry orchard. Here's some beautiful balsam root. So when I say enhancing native habitat, I mean making sure that you don't have, that it's not overrun with weeds, and protecting it as much as possible. You can also see up here, there's a cover crop in bloom. This is all mustard up here. And here's some limatium. All right, so pop quiz, let's see who is paying attention. What is the most important factor for a successful planting? Is it the seed mix, the weather that you have while you're doing it, or site prep, or the time that you plant it? Great. Awesome. Well, I see you guys were paying attention very well. So the seed mix is really important. You guys are right. That is going to determine what kind of bees are visiting your pollinator planting. But in order for anything to be successful, you need to make sure you have excellent site prep, because killing those weeds is going to be key to your success. So I would say site prep. Which brings us to the fifth concept, weed management and site prep. So there are a lot of enemies when we think of weeds, that we're trying to defeat. The Himalayan blackberry is the one that comes to my mind, possibly because I still have scars from pulling it out. And these species can be very hardy and long lasting. So getting rid of them is very important. Unfortunately, also sometimes weedy species or non-native species are included in pollinator mixes. So I just wanted to highlight that one example is bachelor's button, which is oftentimes included in pollinator mixes, but is not actually native to the Pacific Northwest. And so here we have bachelor's button, which is kind of encroaching into some native habitat. So just be careful when you're selecting seed mixes as well. So one of my personal favorite ways to site prep is to use solarization. So solarization is where you take a large roll of like high tunnel plastic. You want this high tunnel plastic to be clear, and you put it over the surface of the soil and bury the edges. And what this clear plastic does is it allows the sunlight to penetrate through the plastic and hit that top layer of soil, and it will cook the weed seeds that are in that soil and kill the seeds and roots that may have been left over when you're doing your general site prep. It's also an organic way to do that if you're concerned with chemical use on your farm. And I also want to point out that Xerces Society, if this is something you're interested in, has some great like timelines where they break down the potential costs of solarization, as well as step-by-step how to do this, which is really nice. A great resource you can just download online. You can also use a cover crop. So this is an example of the Columbia Land Trust, where they have taken this site and put grass cover crop all over it in order to suppress any other plants that were growing there and keep down any weeds before they turn it over into pollinator habitat. And so, yeah, so then in year 2, they are installing clover, which is going to start blooming as well. I also want to mention Bob Falconer, who has done a lot of work on kind of backyard-sized native forage for pollinators. And he uses Phacelia, Lacy Phacelia, and crimson clover. And you can see here those little seedlings. And what he uses, starting in June, plants these different seeds, and then you can see how they progressively bloom by the end of the month. And so really the point here is, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. And so if you can get your seeds to establish really, really well, then they are going to out-compete the weeds that are there, assuming you've done good enough site prep. You can also, there's also burning. So you can use pollinator plants as a cover crop. This is in, I believe, slash piles in forestry, where they're using Phacelia as a cover crop to support pollinators and also suppress weeds. So if you don't do something like solarization, or if you don't successfully pull out all of those weed seeds from the soil, how long do you guys think weed seeds can live? Nice, good job. Great. So I will tell you, you guys are right. Weed seeds, depending on the species, can live over 10 years. Bindweed, for example, commonly lives over 10 years in the soil. And when I was putting together this presentation, I noticed, I encountered an interesting fact where they had mustard seeds that were over 600 years old, and they were able to get 11 of them to germinate. So that's pretty impressive. So point is, if we don't control these seeds, if we don't do proper site prep, then they're just going to keep coming back, and it's going to be a huge issue. So concept number 6, try including bulbs, shrubs, and trees in your planting. Now, obviously, this is really aimed more at permanent plantings rather than something like a cover crop. But for example, we have common camas, which is a bulb plant and very beautiful. There's snowberry, which was also featured in that hedgerow we looked at earlier. Willow species are surprisingly important for pollinators. Most of us don't think about them as pollinator resources, but because they bloom so early in the season and they produce a fair amount of pollen, and they are actually important for both honeybees and native bees. And so they can be a great choice if you're looking at a permanent planting. Big leaf maple is also a great one. These flowers produce a lot of nectar early in the season, which is valuable for pollinators and also especially for honeybees, which are just kind of like waking up at that time. Linden tree is a classic. This is non-native, I believe, but and then there's ceanothus as well. This is a picture from the Dalles, just kind of showing you how beautiful these plants can be and how they can also enhance your landscape, give you something beautiful to look at while supporting native pollinators. And so this is a quote from Neil Bell, who oversees the Master Gardeners program in Marion County. We have some great native trees and shrubs for pollinators. You can easily put together a landscape with bloom that extends from late February to the middle of August just by selecting native trees and shrubs. Oregon grape is another great shrub that you can use. And ocean spray, also kind of late blooming. So what time of year, if you had to guess, do you think we in the Pacific Northwest experience a dearth, which means like a lack or a low quality of resource of flowers? Nice. All right, great job. So you're right. I was actually pretty surprised that by high summer, most of the flowers in the research areas I was looking at had dried up. And I just want to point out that fall and winter are some of the most difficult times to find flowers in bloom in this area. And so there's actually a publication that you can pick up if you're interested in finding flowers that can fill those gaps. One example would be red currant, which is really beautiful, or manzanita. And this is a quote from Dr. Gail Longalato. A lot of people don't recognize the importance of nest sites for bees, in particular, the importance of nest sites for ground nesting bees. So our seventh point that we want to think about is creating or conserving nest habitat opportunities. So most of the native bees of Oregon are solitary ground nesting bees. So that means keeping an area undisturbed of the ground. So this could be dry, rocky soil where native bees are going to want to build their, habitat or their nests. Oh, darn it, I gave away this question. Well, that means you should all get it right. So where do most species of native bee live? Nice. Excellent. You're all listening to me. I like it. Good job. And so this is basically just showing what those holes in the ground look like. They're easy to miss if you're not looking for them. I'll give you a second. Hopefully you can try to spy them on your screen. But that's what they look like. And these nests are supporting a native bee pictured here. And these nests are really fascinating. They can have waterproof coating around the outside of the tunnel. They can be several feet deep, which is a long way to go for a little native bee to dig. This is actually a photo of a wasp nest, but some bees make similar kind of things. So this is showing like a little mud chimney that they built around the nest. And then of course, if you have native habitat, you're going to want to protect the woody shrubs that are there. And because native bees are going to want to nest in those little shrubs. And so here we have Dr. David Gordon showing us that you can actually crack these open and find native bees in there. Do you guys see that? So there's pollen resources and native bees actually sleeping in these stems, being kind of demonstrated for you right here, which is pretty cool. And of course, you're going to want a variety of plants and shrubs, including these spirea, also known as hardhack. Hopefully you can see that. There you go. So pretty cool. And if you have these on your property, you can, give this a try yourself and see if you can find any native bees overwintering in these stems. And this is an example of the small carpenter bee. That's probably who was in there. It's a solitary bee that lives in those twigs and active from April to September. All right, so our final point is going to be to use pesticides carefully. That's important for any bee-friendly practices. So I want to direct you towards this publication, which is available through OSU, but we'll talk about some important points as well. So the most important part of this is protect blooms from pesticide spray. So if you are creating a pollinator habitat that is intended to attract bees, either native bees or honeybees, I think it makes perfect sense that you would then want to, ensure that pesticides are not reaching that floral resource, right? And so one of the ways you can do that is to buffer habitat. So to either turn off the sprayer a row or two from the edge of your pollinator habitat. And this graphic is recommending about 20 feet away, or create physical distance between your orchard and the habitat. And again, here's that photo, and you can see there's like a good gap between this orchard and the native habitat. So we've got some of that space protecting us from drift. And if you know that an area is likely to be sprayed, mow it down. So here's an example of some good practice in a cherry field where pesticide is being applied, but they have mowed the orchard between the orchard rows to prevent any blooms from being down there so that bees are not attracted to those blooms and accidentally getting exposed to pesticides. Of course, always apply pesticides according to the label. The label is the law. All right. So thank you guys so much. Just a quick overview. What did we cover? We talked about the bees of Oregon, including social bees and solitary bees. Solitary bees can either be ground nesting or cavity nesting. We talked about where in your farm you might be able to recognize opportunities for pollinator habitat. And that can include permanent habitat like hedgerows or cover crops and rotational plantings. And then we also talked about concepts for successful pollinator habitat. So regardless of what kind of habitat you're creating, what are some concepts you'll want to incorporate? All right, so this is something I'd really appreciate you guys filling out for me. So please let me know how strongly do you agree with this statement? This presentation helped me understand what bees need to thrive. So, oh, it's going to automatically update, but I promise not to be offended. So 5 being strongly agree and 4 being agree in general. I didn't realize they were going to reorder, so sorry if that's confusing. The higher the number, the more you understood. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for participating in this poll and in this presentation. I would consider adopting some pollinator-friendly practices on my property. How much do you agree with this statement? So 5 is strongly agree, and 1 being strongly disagree. Awesome. Great to see that some of you at least are interested in pollinator habitat. Great. All right. And then this one will not appear on the screen. So feel free to take a picture of this little QR code and let me know if you have any suggestions for this presentation. I really enjoyed putting it together for you all, and I hope that you found it useful. I'm always looking for more ways to improve. So if you have anything that you wanted to learn more about or something that you didn't think was covered, feel free to let me know. And then finally, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who helped support this project and the research here. My research in the Dalles is funded through NRCS, and these are some of the organizations that support me and my research. And thank you to all of you and all of the orchardists who work with us. We really appreciate your participation today. And this is my contact information. So if you have any further questions, feel free to shoot them my way. And I'm not sure what time we're at. Hopefully, do we have time? Do we have time for questions now, or?
Oh yeah, I was reading. Sorry, Emily. I wanted to. There's a couple of. Ashley, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, let's get a couple questions for Emily.
There's a couple that I couldn't answer.
And I also want to say our friends at Hood River Soil Water Conservation District wanted to remind people that they do have a native plant sale. So if these native plants are really exciting you, You can reach out to them to purchase plants at a really reasonable price. And if you're not in Hood River and you're in Washington, I suggest reaching out to your local soil water conservation district there to talk more about native plants. So Emily, one of the questions we have is somebody's wondering about the Himalayan blackberry you mentioned. Can you use those as a habitat for native bees?
Great question. So Himalayan blackberry becomes a very complicated subject because it definitely is providing a large amount of pollen and nectar late in the season. But I would say if you are trying, if you have Himalayan blackberry on your property and you're just not managing it, that's fine. That's your choice. If you're looking to install native habitat, I would never, if you're looking to install pollinator habitat, I would never suggest choosing Himalayan blackberry as that forage. So it's a complicated answer because it is definitely an important resource for honeybees late in the season. And it's common and widespread throughout Oregon and Washington. But I would say, you know, if you can install something else there, that's a good idea.
So Emily, if native bees are attracted to native plants, how active are the bees going to be in the fruit tree flowers if you do put in one of these plantings?
Yeah, so the research that I have been doing, well, in general, the literature is mixed. But the research that I've been doing suggests that native bees are not moving into the orchards. That work is done primarily by honeybees. And so honeybees are spending most of their time in the cherry and the even kind of that understory area. And native bees are spending most of their time either in mass blooming cover crop or in native habitat. So there's not as much crossover between those groups as one might think.
So this is a question I received from a grower about plantings like this, and he's actually not on the call right now, but it's something that we've wondered a lot about. A lot of our people here in the Dalles will apply aerial applications of malathion. Should people that are applying aerial applications of malathion still plant some of these native habitats and plantings? Do you have any suggestions for people that are using a lot of aerial applications?
I'm not very familiar with aerial application, but I imagine drift is a really big concern, and you want to make sure that if you're installing habitat explicitly for the purpose of helping pollinators, you're keeping especially insecticides off of those blooming flowers. And so Andony might have more insight into this, but in general, I would just say it's a good recommendation if you're making these plantings with the goal of supporting pollinators to keep insecticides off of those flowers.
You know, one thing I will just add to that, that's great, Emily. The other thing I would mention is, you know, when you're doing spotted wing Drosophila control, at least in the Dalles, it looks like a lot of those pollinator communities have finished their reproduction. And so if you're looking at a later spray, I think the key idea is that those plants have stopped blooming. You know, the example that we had with Kim Patton in cranberries with those heathers, he's deliberately planting those heathers to bloom at times that don't coincide with pest management. And so I think that's the key dimension is the spatial aspect that Emily raises. But if you don't have that spatial separation, just to make sure that those plants have stopped blooming by the time you're having to do heavy duty pest management.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions for Emily, and Andony, and Chris today?
Somebody asked in the chat about how the diversity changes east to west, and I included a link to a recent research article that produced a heat map of actually global distribution, but it shows Pacific Northwest changes, or the continental United States, how it changes from east to west.
Yeah, can I just say that the gradient at the east of the Cascades is where our bee biodiversity is, not west. So as soon as you kind of get drier and drier, that's when you start to see more and more species.
Great.
Chris, did you have something to add today?
Oh, I think Andony wanted me to talk about natural enemies, and we're pursuing some funding, and we're looking to do some research on measuring the natural enemies that exist in and around pear orchards. And it kind of ties in with what Emily was talking about with the diversity of the landscape around your orchard and the drive rows and these other resources that help support natural enemies that then are able to come in and keep Pearcilla and other pests in check. So we're gonna be looking into that. I'm hoping to do some landscape level assessments of some areas where people get really good natural enemy control and don't need to rely on other chemistries and inputs, and see if we're hoping we can describe what is going on so that we can then export those practices or plantings or plant species or habitats to other problem orchards. So just a peek into the future of what we'd like to look at. So if there's growers listening and you have a problem orchard, let me know so you can be the negative control, the positive control. I need more coffee. I don't know which control you'd be, but if we're looking for research blocks so that we can begin to unpack the complicated issue of natural enemies in Pearcilla.
Do we have any tips for planting things that don't attract gophers? And I know Mike Omek, who's on this call, has some experience with this. And I know from personal experience, if you have something that is like a legume or something that's a nitrogen fixer, those plants are going to attract gophers pretty heavily. And I don't know if anybody has experience with planting like maybe a trap crop of some of these things that are a trap crop of some of these things that you can use to lure the gophers out while still creating a nice pollinator habitat outside of your orchard.
Oh, that's a good idea. I was going to say that there was work done in at WSU with legumes and girdling, and does become a problem. But I think they have some research, and I think NRCS may have been involved. Maybe Carly can speak to this, but in terms of things, there are mixes, there are plants that dissuade, that don't attract rodents, and so those are key in planting between rows. But alyssum, I remember, was one of those plants that just rodents. Oh, there he goes. Mike says, do not plant legumes with fleshy roots. Fibrous roots like vetch are good. Is that right, Mike? Okay. That's awesome to know. I love vetch.
All right, if we don't have any more questions for Emily, I am going to hand this over to Carly to talk about the NRCS programs that are currently available to growers in Oregon.
Thank you, Ashley. All right, now I get to struggle with sharing my screen. Let's see if I can get this working. And are we good? And can you guys hear me?
Yeah, it looks great. We can hear and see you, Carly.
Awesome, thank you. So I think a lot of the information that was shared today was just super. And I'm glad that you mentioned the stuff about the plant sale with the Soil and Water Conservation District, because I was going to mention that at the end. But for those who don't know me, I am Carly Heron. I'm the district conservationist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Hood River County. And with all this information, we get to tie into the fact that we actually have a bit of a funding avenue for some of these pollinator type projects here in Hood River County. And so our program is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or otherwise known as EQIP. And under EQIP, we have a pot of money or funding pool that is pertains to this pollinator and beneficial insects type projects. It's under a big name, this pollinator and beneficial insects for Mid-Columbia Basin fruit crops, but you can just ask us about the pollinator project and we'll know what you're talking about. So EQIP, what is it? Well, for those who don't know, EQIP provides financial and technical assistance to ag producers in order to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits such as improved water and air quality, conserve ground and surface water, reduced erosion and sedimentation, or improved and created wildlife habitat. So that's where we paired it up with this. And a CIS is a conservation implementation strategy, which is basically a document that we wrote, which explains how we've used a local working group, and the local working group is made up of the public and various partners, and they provide input on what resource concerns in which geographic priority area in the county that they want to direct the future EQIP funding towards. And then it's the way that we get targeted conservation on the ground in a timely manner. So it's how we tell NRCS where we want those EQIP funds to go in the county. And so this specific CIS was developed in 2019 for a funding period of 2020 through 2024. So this will be our second year with it. And its focus is on the pollinator and beneficial insect habitat for orchards, berry growers, and vineyards. And so some practices that are available through this implementation strategy. This is not an all-inclusive list, but there's some examples here. We can do hedgerows, wildlife habitat planting. That's sort of like for small areas where if you wanted to do like the native plantings of be it trees, shrubs, and forbs, or even just a wildflower kind of a mix in an area. Cover crop, conservation cover, which is kind of like a cover crop except it's more permanent. So cover crop would be something that would be coming out after a year. Site prep, so anything to like Emily was talking about, we're going to get rid of those weeds, get it prepared before we do the seeding on any of those areas. Tree and shrub plantings, integrated pest management, so to try and deal with the whole gamut of what goes into dealing with all the pest management things that go on in the operation. And we're working with OSU and the Xerxes Society and NRCS to try and bring that into a more focused approach so it's not such a cumbersome practice that we're dealing with. And then micro irrigation that would go hand in hand with anything like a hedgerow or a tree and shrub planting, where maybe those things need just kind of a little bit of lift for that first year to get them up and running. And then mulching, like we might be putting down some mulch on some of those plantings, again, just for that kind of boost for those first couple of years to get those plants up and running. So my mouse back here. So then the question, of course, is, well, how does this all work? So you're going to submit an application and you can get one of those from your local NRCS office. And if you're selected for a contract, then with assistance from your NRCS office, you'll install the contracted practices according to the specifications and job sheets that'll be provided. You'll work with the DC or the planner, so the NRCS folks, to develop those and see what'll work for your area, your site, and those specific practices, and help build something that'll meet your needs and the needs of the practice so that everything can be amenable to everybody. And then once the practices have been certified as complete by the NRCS local representative, then a payment can be issued. And generally the payments are at a 50% cost share rate. So how cost share works, for those who aren't familiar, is that you would pay out the amount to do the practice. Then after you've gotten the okay that you've done the practice correctly, we reimburse you. So you get the 50% cost share rate, although under some circumstances, if you've met certain qualifications, you can be up to a 75% cost share. Here's just an example of one of the payment rates for conservation cover. That's the one I was telling you that's kind of more of a permanent planting. So just as an example, we as an agency would consider what people refer to as a cover crop around here, but it's the permanent cover of grasses and things that are in an orchard. That's what is conservation cover in our nomenclature. So just for an example here, you can see that in orchard and vineyards, what they would pay for per acre for planting there. But then if you went to do pollinator species, that it's a much higher payment rate. And then the HU refers to historically underserved. So that's what at that 75% cost share rate. I have to admit, I do not know what WP means this year. This is a new one on me, and they just threw this one out. So I haven't had a chance to research that yet. That's brand new to me. But I'm used to working with the regular and the HU. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like there. And then like the pollinator species with foregone income, that'd be like if you had removed some orchard to put in, or vineyard or berry area or something. So you had to give up some income to put in some pollinator habitat. So those are some different ideas if you're thinking about what you're going to do and how that's going to all work out. Then it just kind of gives you an idea of how that would pay. And then just as a thank you for listening, and I wanted to give you the contact for myself and for Emily, who is our planner in the office now. So you feel free to email either one of us or give us a call, and we'd be happy to send you an application or answer any questions that you have. And we're really excited to get this up and running. I know that there's been some discussion about using this to try and treat some of the abandoned orchards in the valley, and try and deal with some of those pest management concerns and stuff. So we're really excited to kind of get it up and running a little bit more. It's always sort of fumbles in that first year. So we've had a few contracts, but we'd like to get more going. And it does cross over into Wasco County as well. So it is operating over in Wasco County. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Any questions for Carly about this program? So Carly, can you just tell us about how many people have decided to take part in this program?
I don't know off the top of my head how many are over in Wasco County, since I don't handle their contracts, but we had several applications last year. I think due to the pandemic and economic issues and stuff, we had a few who didn't follow through, but we had 2 contracts come to fruition, get obligated last year, and we've had several make application this year that are in the hopper for being ranked and stuff this year. So we're excited about that.
And someone's asking what those historically underserved populations you mentioned, what that means exactly.
So there's different categories for historically underserved. You would check which one you would qualify for on the application. There can be beginning farmer, there can be a veteran / beginning farmer, socially disadvantaged. So there's just different categories that they would meet. Oh, limited resource producer also, sorry.
So I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us. Any more questions for Carly about this program? And Carly, could they just email you or just call the office? Is that the best thing to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if anybody has any more questions for Carly about this program, please email her or call the office. If you joined us a little bit late and you were here for most of the presentation today, if you'd like to put your full name as it appears on your pesticide license and your pesticide license number in the chat box, I can give you 1 pesticide credit for joining us today. All right, and I'd like to again thank everybody. This will be recorded and I will send this out probably early next week. And just another plug, we're going to be trying to do these most weeks in February and March. And so please join us next week for our spotted lanternfly presentation. That's going to be about the spotted lanternfly, which is a new invasive pest in the United States. We're going to have somebody talking to us about how to scout for this pest and where to what its biology it is, where it likes to live, and this will eventually become an issue in orchards, and we've already found it in container cropping systems in the Willamette Valley. So it's just a matter of time before it gets here. So let's make sure we're all well prepared. And thank you all again.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank
for
you so
organizing.
much.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks everybody that can make it. Thanks for our speakers, and Chris did a great job very last minute putting together the answers to those questions. So thank you.